Hello and welcome back to DGS Decodes. I'm Gayathri, a legal associate here at DGS Associates. Together with my colleagues Aditi and Salonee, we present to you DGS Decodes, a monthly podcast series that decodes intricate and interesting legal measures and their impact on Indian businesses. We read so you don't have to. Last month, on our pilot podcast episode, we spoke about European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also known as CBAM, and its implications on Indian businesses. So, we basically spoke about what exactly CBAM is, who is it applicable to, when does it become applicable, what are Indian businesses supposed to be aware of, and also how they can cope with this new regime. So, if you're interested to find out more about CBAM, please check out the link in our description provided below. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our viewers for giving us such a warm response for our pilot series. We hope that we can continue our podcast series with more interesting topics and a more interactive session with you guys as well. Today on DGS Decodes, we will attempt to decode semiconductors, the industry, the product, and most importantly for Indian business persons, what exactly are the regulations on semiconductors, related softwares, technologies, and also we will touch upon how Indian government has launched new avenues for Indian businesses to enter into these industries, the incentives and the initiatives that they have taken. Now, before we speak about the legal implications of semiconductors, I think it's important to know what exactly a semiconductor is, or as they're more colloquially known as chips. So, Salonee, if you can please take us away.
So, semiconductors, as the name suggests, are objects which conduct electricity sometimes. So, they're made of elements such as silicon, germanium, gallium oxide, in which certain impurities are added so that we can, say, manufacture electrical impulses in a way that a particular appliance requires. Now, a semiconductor is such an essential part of the electronic industry is that even the smallest things such as an AC or a refrigerator would have a semiconductor, and the world's smartest computer would also have a semiconductor. So it's something that, say, is the linchpin behind a lot of products within the industry. Since it's a heavily regulated industry, we need to understand how these chips and their products are actually manufactured. So there are 6 types of units created in this world where the manufacturing is divided. The first is the fabless chip companies, where design of these chips takes place. Then there are foundries or fabs, where the manufacturing of these chips takes place. Then there are outsourced semiconductor assembly and test facilities, where semiconductors themselves are assembled and of course tested. Then there are places where these semiconductors are embedded into the final product, which are called the embedded system in packet realization centers. Now, the technology behind these chips are actually held in separate IP centers because that is where the minds of creating that technology lie, which are called the chip intellectual property cores. And finally, there are centers where all of these functions happen together, which are called the integrated device manufacturing centers. Today, various countries, especially the US and India, are trying to increase their manufacturing of semiconductors by creating foundries and labs.
Thank you, Salonee, for giving us a very comprehensive introduction to semiconductors. I think people who are not really from the industry will also get an idea about what exactly semiconductors are and how the industry exactly is set up here. So I think it's a good time to move forward with what the regulations are there in this industry.
Sure, Gayatri. To understand the regulation of the semiconductor industry, it is essential that we understand the industry itself, where the present players of the industry are based, what are the requirements of the industry, such as what can every country offer, whether it be intellectual resources, manpower resources, natural resources, etc. And most importantly, the geopolitical situation in the world, primarily the US-China relationship and the Russia-Ukraine war. Taking these things into consideration, regulation of the semiconductor industry essentially happens at 2 levels. First is the country level or the national level, and the second is the international level.
It's very interesting.
With respect to the national regulation of the semiconductor industry, Ideally, the regulations are of two kinds. You have regulations that promote the production of semiconductors in their territory, and you have regulations that deal with the export of the semiconductors out of their territory. Now, with respect to, as Salonee had mentioned, semiconductors itself is a very foundational industry. So, if I may draw reference to the recent Deadpool movie, the semiconductor industry is essentially an anchor being. So, it impacts the entire economy and drives the economy in a certain way. If a country has a semiconductor industry, in today's day, that is the same thing as having oil. So it is a very, very foundational thing, and a lot of countries are working towards enhancing the production of the semiconductors in their territory. So you have production-based policies or laws that are coming in. For example, you have the US and the EU that have recently introduced the CHIPS Act. You have India that has the Indian Semiconductor Mission. You have Japan, which is subsidizing a lot of their semiconductor activities. Similarly, so a lot of the countries that are acting on this front already are leaders in the semiconductor industries, like for example South Korea, US, Taiwan, Japan, etc. And a lot of the countries are trying to enter the arena, like for example India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. So that is one aspect. Second is with respect to regulation of export controls. Essentially, the countries that presently have export control laws are US, Japan, and Netherlands that are really impacting the semiconductor exports. Essentially, US has laws, export control laws that are country specific, whereas Netherlands and Japan have more on a blanket basis. Apart from this, on an international level, you have the Wassenaar Arrangement dual use list. So the Wassenaar Arrangement is essentially 42 countries that have come together and have created an export control framework. The hot topic this year for the Wassenaar Arrangement meeting is the semiconductor industry. And secondly, you have the established market industries, which is basically industries of the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, coming together to form the CHIPS 4, basically trying to regulate the availability of chips in the international market. So all of these are done essentially to tilt the scale from China and allies perspective to a US and ally perspective.
This sounds like a very complex industry with a lot of regulatory and compliance implications. So as to acclimate our viewers a little better, Salonee, can we talk about the major players in this industry and where exactly does India stand here?
Interestingly, different countries have different amount of hold over the semiconductor supply chain. India actually has the largest talent pool, to the point that when India, China, and US come together, that holds 50% of the talent pool within the industry.
That's wonderful.
And actually, India has distinguished itself with the go-to destination tag for design and compatibility testing, which are known as global capacity centers. However, on the other hand, Russia holds the largest chunk of critical minerals which are necessary to create semiconductors. Then top chip design companies actually come from places like Taiwan and the US, which include say Intel, Texas Instruments, AMD, Nvidia, which are all from the US. Qualcomm is from the US, and they all have design and R&D centers in India. However, Taiwan manufactures about 50% of the world's semiconductors. Major companies in the industry, which both design and manufacture chips, are Taiwan-based TSMC and PSMC, US-based Qualcomm, Nvidia, Global Foundries.
Now that we've understood this complex industry a little better and where exactly India is standing as a player, I think this is a very good time to talk about what regulations India has introduced. So, Salonee, can we talk about what measures India has introduced to enhance semiconductor production in India?
Actually, at this point, India is at the forefront of ensuring that it's increasing its capacity of manufacturing semiconductors, because it has already defined itself as a go-to place for, say, the biggest minds in semiconductors.
Exactly.
For this, we have introduced something called the India Semiconductor Mission, or the ISM, under which various schemes have been introduced by the government, which help companies both finance their semiconductor industries and plus give incentives in terms of saying that your demand will be realized through public procurement. So a lot of these, say, schemes are, for example, the modified scheme for setting up of semiconductor fabs and display fabs in India, the modified scheme for setting up of compound semiconductors, silicon photonics, sensor fabs and discrete semiconductors, the modified scheme of semiconductor assembly, testing, marking and packaging, and the modified scheme for setting up of outsourced semiconductor assembly and testing facilities. What is to be noted is that these schemes are open to both Indian and foreign players, so long as the facilities are opened on Indian soil. So a lot of foreign investment is also being drawn in by a lot of these schemes. However, these are schemes which are open to say larger companies. Therefore, players like Tata and Micron have invested quite a bit in it. However, India has also thought about its MSMEs and smaller companies which would like to enter the space of semiconductors. So for them, some of the schemes are the design linked incentive scheme, through which domestic companies, startups, MSMEs, etc., who are engaging in design get certain benefits. There is a semiconductor laboratory in Mohali which has opened up, where people can go and say throw ideas against each other, test their semiconductors, do things like that. There are also state-wise incentives such as Gujarat, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu have brought in various incentives in order to say push for semiconductor facilities to be brought up. And that actually brings to the two semiconductor fabs which have already opened in Gujarat due to all of these incentives. One is the Tata and PSMC partnership, and the other is the Micron facility which has now opened up. There are also the scheme for the promotion of manufacturing of electronic components in the semiconductor industry called the SPEC scheme. And the basic customs duty on semiconductors is also reduced to zero at this stage. So, and additionally, for people who don't want to clearly enter the semiconductor space but want to get involved in manufacturing electronic components for semiconductors, there's also a production linked incentive scheme on those particular players. In the union budget of 2024, which has just come out, around 6,000 crores have been put in the semiconductor industry. So the Indian Semiconductor Mission is trying to ensure that with some assistance from the state and central government, India comes to the forefront of manufacturing semiconductors, and it's also pushing smaller businesses to start designing and testing these semiconductors through all of these schemes.
Very interesting. So basically the ball is steadily rolling on a production manufacture of semiconductor industry in India. So I think this is a good time to also talk about the export related laws that the semiconductor industry is subject to in India.
Right, Gayatri. So the laws relating to the export of semiconductors essentially are two types. You have the prohibitions or the sanctions, which are to certain countries or to certain individuals mentioned in the foreign trade policy of India. And you have the regulations, which basically require the exporter to get a particular authorization either from the Directorate General for Foreign Trade or the Department of Defense Production, Ministry of Defense, depending on what your product is. So you have the prohibitions and you have the regulations. With respect to prohibitions, the prohibitions are country specific. So you have DPRK, Iran, Iraq. With respect to entities, you have entities such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, and the ISIL,
very reasonable,
which you're not allowed to export semiconductors to. Apart from that, you have restrictions or export control laws. Like I said, India's export control laws are largely based on the Wassenaar Arrangement. So we have to await and see what is going to be the outcome of the discussions to be held at the Wassenaar Arrangement this year. But having said that, there are still semiconductor products that are regulated under the present export control list of India, also called the SCOMET list. These are semiconductor photocathodes, microprocessors, integrated circuits. Then you have equipment for manufacturing of semiconductors, equipment for testing of semiconductors, materials required for semiconductor manufacturing, such as gallium oxide, image sensor, semiconductor, lasers, etc. If you have any specific query, you can feel free to reach out to us. So this is essentially with respect to the regulation of export of semiconductors in India. However, I would like to point out that it is also relevant to know the export control laws of the country to which you are exporting, or in some cases you will see that the export is the company is basically funded by a foreign investor. So maybe the investors laws will also come into play. So it's always a good idea to approach your lawyer to determine what really is applicable before you engage in the trade, so that you've covered your backs and your business is clear of any export control or other legal violations.
Yeah, so that no customs officer can tell you
Right.
not to export your product.
Right. It doesn't get stuck indefinitely.
Yeah. At this point, a question on a lot of our viewers' minds could be, what are the overall challenges to India establishing a semiconductor industry?
Right, Gayatri. So the challenges essentially are, of course, the expensive nature of the industry. So there's going to be immense investment to even set it up. Second is, of course, regulatory red tapeism that can often be linked to government functioning. Third is that there is also regulatory uncertainty from the perspective of a foreign investor. You never know when the policies and the law of the government can change. Fourth is, of course, the high tariffs that are presently there to both, especially to import electronic products. And in case export control laws do come in, the challenges that would be there to export the finished products at a later stage. Is it really worth it? And the most prominent challenge is, of course, presently, while, like Salonee mentioned, there is a lot of talent pool when it comes among Indian engineers with respect to the design of semiconductor products. Presently, with respect to the manufacturing process, there is a lacuna in that regard. While the Minister of Electronics and IT has mentioned that the NITs and the IITs will be working hard to fill this lacuna and training their engineering students accordingly, this is going to take a few years. So it's very, it's probably something that the foreign investors will have while considering investing into India. But having said that, it's not all bad news. I would like us to conclude on a positive note that undoubtedly India's potential in the semiconductor sector is immense, and everybody is recognizing it. It is not really something that is in question. In this regard, you see a lot of activity in the semiconductor industry presently. Like, for example, you have US MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, for the semiconductor industry and technology transfer relating to it. You have you have similar MOUs with EU, UK, and several other countries in the pipeline. You also have partnerships of several state governments with large semiconductor companies. For example, you have the PSMC agreement to set up India's semiconductor fabs. You have the agreement with the Japanese company Rapidus. So, I mean, there are a lot of things in the pipeline, and I feel there's going to be a lot of action in this industry, especially in India. So we should wait and watch.
And I believe that while US and India were signing this pact, there was a requirement to test India's readiness of entering into the space, and it ended on a very positive note, which actually led to the MOU that we have in
that got
front of us today.
concluded.
So, as we suggest, India is ready for this change to happen, but we'll have to see how the regulations change over time, where the talent pool comes from, and a various list of things.
Right.
This is all great information. It's wonderful to know that India is putting in such an effort into building this industry up, and Indian businesses are getting these initiatives and incentives to join this particular industry. So today on DGS Decodes, we talked about what exactly semiconductor is, how does the industry look like, what are the regulations that concern this industry, and then we moved on to what Indian businesses who deal with this particular industry should be aware of, especially regarding regulations and export control laws. And also we touched upon things regarding the advantages that an Indian business can avail in this particular industry, and also the impact of foreign investments in this particular. Now, as has already been discussed by Aditi, this is a very complex industry with a lot of compliance and regulatory challenges. So it's actually very important that
business persons are legally aware of the changing laws, the evolving regime. So it's important to seek legal advice in these regards so as to keep up to date about these laws and also to ensure that your operations are in compliance with the law. Now, with that, we've come to the end of our session. So thank you for tuning in for our episode today. Today we had a very informative session about semiconductors, and I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into this sector and the measures that India has taken. Now, if you have any further queries, questions, concerns, you can always reach out to us. You can comment down below, or you can reach us out at the email in the description below. Now, with that, we've come to the end of the session. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in our next episode.
Thank you.